Hello. All right, so we are going to talk about story mapping, but first I do want to tell you a little bit about myself so that you know I'm a human being and not a talking machine. So this is me, Chisa. And yes, I love riding horses, so that's something I do here in London. And just a little bit about what I do for Pivotal. Simon has already mentioned that I'm the Staff Technical Program Manager here in London. And what that effectively means is I help teams to be more effective by shortening feedback loops. But it also takes on a lot of other interesting and challenging opportunities. So I do a lot with the community here in London, a lot with both product side of labs and research and development, so I'm on the Cloud Foundry side. And yeah, the other half or portion of what I do is I'm on the Diversity and Inclusion Global Council. So I help to co-lead EMEA just because we only have 2 people in EMEA on the council. Papa's right there, that's my partner. And more specifically though, I work with the Executive Leadership Strategy team. And so we work with executive leadership to figure out what does a diverse and inclusive environment look like at Pivotal and how can we effectively make it better. So that in a nutshell is the way that my job kind of manifests here at Pivotal. It's a combination of strategic stuff, process stuff, enablement, and they're also tactical, just get it done type of tasks that I have to do. And the tool that we're talking about today is something that I use on both halves of my Pivotal brain. So let's go ahead and start getting into it. But before we get into it, I want to talk about shared understanding because that's one of the key reasons that you use this particular tool. So does everyone for the most part understand or have experience with what shared understanding means? Okay, I see one hand. Okay, 5. All right, great. So this is why we're going to talk about it. Shared understanding. There are a couple definitions that I found that I thought encompassed it fairly well. The first is by Jeff Patton in his book, User Story Mapping. And it's when we both understand what the other person is imagining and why. The other definition, thank you Google, that I found was by IGI Global, and individual and collective ownership of a new perspective accepted by the group. So the whole point of creating shared understanding is that even though you think you might understand the same thing, it may actually end up looking very different once you put it down on paper. So I actually have an example, I believe it's in Jeff's book, called the cake order. So customer, hello, I'd like to order a cake. Employee, sure, what would you like written on it? Customer then says, could you write so long Alicia in purple? Sure. And put stars around it. No problem, I've written this up and we'll hand it to my cake decorator right away. We'll have it for you in the morning. So this seems like a pretty clear exchange. This is what they got. So obviously I'm guessing this isn't what the customer had in mind, I'm guessing. So clearly something was lost in translation, even though the words were very, very clear. So this kind of speaks to one really important thing, which is that shared documents are not the same thing as shared understanding. And it really isn't even just documents. It could be shared words or vocabulary. Words can take on a lot of different meanings depending on the context that you bring. It could be documentation. It could be a lot of things. And this is a comment that is actually really popular because it really gets the message across really well. But when it comes to shared understanding, you have to take the time to do it right. So I mentioned, I'm glad we all agree, you've got this idea of what agreement looks like in your mind. But when you actually write it down, you realize you have completely different ideas of what it's supposed to be. The other thing that's cool is once you write it down, you may realize that when combining your vision of what the agreement looks like with everyone else's, you optimize and create something even better, something even more comprehensive. After doing this, everyone actually leaves with agreement. Like you actually have created something, have shared ownership, and are all seeing the same thing. So That is a 5-minute definition of shared understanding. So now I know we're here. Story maps. So what is a story map? A story map is where it arranges user stories into a useful model. So it helps you to do a variety of different things. I've put together a list of some of the biggest ones that I think are really important. So understanding a system's functionality, identifying holes, omissions in your backlog, effectively prioritizing and grooming your backlog so that value is delivered every iteration. It also promotes shared understanding, which we've gone through in depth. And this is because it has client involvement and it also has a collaborative approach. Also helps to measure feature completeness, so you can very easily see how much have we done, how much is left. And it provides a radiator or a tool around which you can discuss and manage the scope. So let's have an example. I'm going to tell you a story. So this is Drew. And Drew just got a phone call from his friends, and they want to know if he'd like to go to the club. So Drew was like, I would love to go to the club, but in order to do that, first I'm going to need some money. So Drew needs to figure out, does he have enough money to get to the club? So the scope of what we're trying to do is we want to get Drew to the club. In order to do that, he needs to know, does he have enough money in his bank account? So some assumptions that we have. Excuse me. What do we already know about Drew and this situation? So we're assuming that Drew has a bank account, so he's an existing customer at a bank. We're also assuming that Drew can get to the bank on his own, so we don't have to worry about that. And we're going to assume that Drew knows how to use an ATM, so he has experience with the existing system. Now, let's map out the scenario. Drew goes clubbing. To start, we have Drew. And he drives to the bank, uses the ATM, and sees account activity, because again, he needs to figure out, does he have enough money to get to the bank? Then from there, this can go one of two ways. Drew can realize that he doesn't have enough money and it's time to go home. Or he can realize that he has enough money to withdraw, gets a receipt, and can then go on and enjoy his merriment with his friends. So this high-level set of steps is effectively the journey that Drew can take with a couple directional decisions. Now, if we take a look at it and go into further detail, we'll realize that under some of these steps, there's actually more detail that can be fleshed out. So when we say see account activity, what do we mean? We could mean just see an account balance. We could mean see balances in multiple accounts. And we could also mean see transaction activity, because maybe Drew's been going to the club a little bit too much, and he should just, even if he has the money, he should chill out, right? Additionally, there may be some options that he might want presented in terms of taking money out. He might want a default amount, maybe he wants a customized amount, maybe he wants to choose which account he's taking the amount out from. So we capture that. Then, if you take a look, you'll see there's some steps that, as we've already kind of called out, aren't really relevant to what we need to do for Drew, but it's good to know that it's relevant to Drew. Okay, so on this one, you'll see we've organized, we're just looking at the two steps in his journey, see account activity and withdraw cash. But within that, there may be a slice of things that make sense for us to do first, or for us to attempt or try first to prove out whether this solution or this path is even going to work to help Drew get to the club. So what I've done is moved up the things that I think are relevant that we may want to do first, and that's what that arrow, can you see the arrow? I can't tell the light, okay. Yeah. That arrow is that first slice of things that I think makes sense to do first to determine can we get Drew to the club. The other thing that's cool is that this automatically determines, okay, now we understand what are our highest priority things that we need to achieve first. Everything else is effectively lower priority because those aren't the most relevant things that we need to do in order to determine, again, can he get there? So let's review what we just did. The first thing you'll notice is that we set the stage with a title and captured assumptions around our scenario. So we had a descriptive title of what we were trying to achieve, which was getting Drew, our user, to the flow. From there, we mapped out the scenes and the corresponding actors. So in this particular scenario, the only one that I captured was Drew, but who knows, there may have been other people working in the background. Like maybe he went during the daytime and didn't use an ATM, and he ended up working with a bank teller. But it's important to map out who's actually doing the thing on a given step, and it doesn't always necessarily have to be your main user, your main character, your main actor in this movie that you're creating. So map out the users and map out the high-level steps. After you get the high level, then you can start to add some of that granularity. So you definitely want to start by kind of creating your backbone of skeleton, and then you can go in and say, okay, let's start to add some muscle, let's start to add some meat to it. As well, we did capture assumptions at the higher level scenario level, but there also may be some assumptions that you want to keep in mind in each particular piece of detail or step. And it's totally okay to capture those, and I actually encourage you to do so. And the same thing goes with tasks. There may be tasks or questions that you have. There may be pains that you're aware of. Also capture those. Lastly, you then reorganize based on priority. So out of all of these details, which ones are the most important that need to float to the top? That can be done through a variety of different activities, but one that I actually really like to do because it's fun is, I call it the red ribbon activity, and you actually, in your mind or physically, can draw a line to connect which ones actually need to happen. So this is effectively what's happening, again, whether physically or mentally. And then from there, you have a map that kind of shows you, okay, this first slice is what happens first, these might be what happens second, everything else we'll get to when we get to it. So walking the map effectively helps you determine your product backlog. It also makes sure that you do the highest priority thing or the highest value items first. But keep in mind, these change, and it's okay for them to change over time. Because as you do one thing, you'll learn something, and maybe something comes up, maybe something comes down, or maybe things just get completely eliminated. So it's meant to be a dynamic, living thing, and effectively help to facilitate and foster discussion. So the other thing is, if you have this map, you can create multiple maps for various journeys underneath a given user, and you have a collection of maps that then help to inform your bigger picture. So under Drew, he may have multiple goals that he's trying to achieve. He may be trying to save for the future, he may be trying to pay bills on the go, or he may be trying to get money to go to the club, which we just mapped out together. But one thing that's really cool about this is you can kind of see how a hierarchical taxonomy is created, where each individual piece of functionality or each effort that you do, you can see how that value ties all the way back up the chain to the bigger picture. And it helps you to justify why you're doing that one little thing, because it has a clear chain of events, or a clear chain of, again, taxonomy or hierarchy, all the way back up to your bigger type. And then, hey, I already said this, but it's effectively a backlog. When you have a flat list or a flat backlog, it's really difficult to see and understand how do all of these pieces fit together. And even if your backlog ends up becoming a flat list, when you start with a flat list, a lot of the relationships that exist may end up getting missed because you just didn't take the time to visualize and see it. If everyone is walking away with this picture, then even if you're looking at a list now, you still understand where it belonged later. I always equivocate it to the animal kingdom. So I don't need to pull out a chart every time I look at a lion to know that it's part of the feline family, to know that we're all mammals, but that's because way back when someone showed and explained that picture to me. Sorry. Okay, so on that note, the flat backlog is actually a poor explanation of what a system does. The new user story backlog is a map. And if you think about it as a map, it makes it a lot easier to understand how you're taking a user on a journey how your team is going on a journey to provide value or a solution to a user. So in this manner, language is actually very important because it helps to frame the way that you may want to encourage your teams to think about the work that they do. And then this is just an example of a real life story map that was created a little while ago here at Pivotal. But you can see how effectively it's a map. You can see the steps, you can see the assumptions that come in, as well as the stories that, well, potential stories or opportunities that are seen. There's even a feedback loop in there, which is pretty interesting. And when done with stickies and on a dry erase board, it's very easy to move things around, make connections where they need to be, and nothing is permanent. So we're going to go through, and I'm just going to answer a couple questions that I thought of before, but obviously we'll have time to answer more questions later. The first one is, when should I use story maps? So this is a pretty standard journey that we have at Pivotal. You start with a high-level vision, which is 10,000 feet, I guess, so decades up. You then come up with a strategy of how you're going to realize that vision. That's maybe over the next few years. Then you have a roadmap, which has timeline and tactics around how you intend to execute on that strategy. And that may be over the course of a couple quarters or a few months. And then you have a backlog with more explicit details to flesh out that product roadmap. And that happens over the course of a few weeks. When we talk about story mapping, we're talking about the backlog. So we're talking about towards the end, when you're getting into those details. So you already know a lot of the high-level stuff about how things will fit in. And it's important that you're clear on this first before you dive down and start mapping out those specific details. If you try to skip 2 details before all of the other stuff is done, then you're going to be missing a lot, because a lot of the scope that you're dealing with won't have been proved out, a lot of the assumptions won't have been clarified, and you may be looking at the wrong set of details because you've gone too far deep and too deep too soon. This doesn't mean, though, that you can't take this activity and translate it into other places. So you can use story mapping to do future mapping. It's effectively the same exercise, but it's happening at a different level. Pretty kind of in the strategy road mapping place, but again, you can kind of use it to just high level map out where do you think everything goes and fit it, but it's just important to clarify and acknowledge the level that you're at and the level of detail that you need to get to depending on where you're at. The other thing is your initial story map may seem as though you're really talking about stories, but when you take a closer look at those stories, you realize that most of them are really huge epics. And that's okay as well. It's, again, about kind of placing things where you think that they go, and you can always refine, add more detail, take things away. So isn't this just for product people? I think it's interesting because a lot of people assume that tools like this only affect, well, they affect everyone, but they assume that the product person on the team is the only person that needs to own it. Sorry, one second. And the truth is, that's a bad idea. You definitely want more people in the room than just the product person. And creating a story map truly is a team effort. Everyone needs to be involved for a variety of reasons. I've captured a few, which we'll get to a little bit later. But in terms of who should be in the room, if you can have users, that's great. If you can't have users, then have a proxy. Also having other actors in the journey, so besides the primary user, if you can get other people that are directly going to be affected by what you are creating or what you're mapping, it's always great to hear it directly from the source. The product manager should be there, or your analyst, however your team is set up. But you also definitely want to have engineering there. Not because they're going to tell you all the implementation details from the start, but they can provide context and provide perspective to think about that later. Same thing with UX and design. Like, again, it's about getting different minds to think about and attack this from different places, as well as potentially subject matter experts around the topic that you're discussing. And I think that it's really important to highlight engineering because this seems like it's a business thing, it seems like it's a product thing, but Creating something in a silo and then handing it over to engineering defeats the purpose of making sure that there's that shared understanding and shared context. And when engineering especially has an opportunity to be a chance and take ownership in the thing that's being created from the start, it's a lot easier to then understand and translate into, we talked about this, I understand the context of why we're making it yellow, why we're going to use this tool instead of that, and based on that, I can then make suggestions or be better informed about how to then implement. So why should I care? And I explained this a little bit just now, but you all own the outcome. And the reason I chose this photo from Sister Act, I hope that this is a reference that, anyway, even if it's not, the point is, when you have a choir, you need a collection of voices in order to balance the sound, right? So when you do a collective activity, if you have people that are missing, your choir is going to sound crazy, okay? And the same thing applies when you think about your outcomes. You want a balanced set of people with a balanced set of perspectives to provide an even sound for your output. And it's very, very important. This is just a short list of some of the reasons why. But if you need to convince somebody, why is it important that they're there? You can say it's because story mapping actually works. There's proven evidence. You can say because it's a low-cost activity. This is going to take 2 hours. We can flesh it out now, as opposed to spending lots later because we've discovered that something was missing because the right person wasn't in the room later. Product people don't know everything, and when we assume that they're the only ones that need to be in the room, we're effectively saying I'm just saying we only need you because you've got everything, and I don't need to say anything. On the flip side, your input is valuable. Everyone's input on the team is valuable. You can also use some metaphors. Tell them it's like making a movie. We can't make a movie without you. Measure twice, cut once. Again, low-cost activity to make sure that you're measuring twice and cutting once. And lastly, if I asked you to draw me a picture of what we are building and why, could you do it? Would it look the same as to you as it does to someone else? And how confident are you about that? Would you bet your lunch on it? Would you bet your life on it? How confident are you? And if the answer to that is I'm extremely confident this is right, when I draw it, so-and-so across the room is going to see the same thing, then they can kind of self-assess and realize maybe I should just take 2 hours to do this activity because what's 2 hours? So in a nutshell, to recap the steps that we just went over, set the stage with assumptions and a title for the scenario, map out the scenes with corresponding actors, add details and particulars, then determine the slice of your work, so the red ribbon, and then take that slice and determine your development strategy. These are definitely in sequential order, so that's why they're numbered. Like in this order. And then lastly, just some lessons that I've learned over time that I found really important, so things to remember. Give it a name. Giving something a name helps to ground it and helps to frame for everyone, this is what we're building and this is what we are not building. Call out assumptions at different levels. So don't just think that if you call out assumptions at the scenario level that you're good and there aren't going to be assumptions at lower levels and vice versa. Track your actors or your users at each step and work one layer of granularity at a time. So don't try to do everything for one step. Create that baseline. Sketch out just where you're putting out things, and then go in and add detail. Also keep in mind that every step does not necessarily require an action. So again, that's kind of like a double-sided thing, because you want to capture all the steps that a user is going through, but that doesn't mean that every single step that you capture is going to require work on behalf of your team or on behalf of someone or anyone, period. You still want to understand what all is happening here. And then use a legend and color code it. This is in part because it's prettier, but more importantly, it makes it a lot easier for someone coming in to see what's happening. Because you explain them the legend and where everything goes, and they can look at that legend and understand, I know how to use this map. The same way that legends work on any other kind of map. And then your secret weapon. And then what happens? And then what happens? And then tell me what happens next. if you're facilitating this, that's really the only thing. That's just kidding. You need to know more. But that's the main question that I ask once the activity gets going. Just tell me what happens next. I want to know more. Tell me what happens after that. What happens after that? And after a while, people will realize, oh, we're just working through the steps. We're just going to capture and get the steps out. Let's get everything out, and then we can talk about them and discuss it later. Lastly, this is not initially about implementation. It's about the user. So it's not about your solution. It's about what's happening. Tell me the state that we're in, whether it's future or current, but tell me the state that we're in. We don't need in-depth technical detail. What's more important is why are we going to choose the technical details later? And we know that because we've clarified this is where we're coming from. So, on that note, for more information, you could just read the book. This was more visual, obviously more colorful, but you could also just read the book for more details. There's a lot of great information in it. I highly recommend it. But yeah, make your movie shine. I hope that what I've shared with you will help you to do that. It's not a presentation without Michael. So, but yeah, and that's basically all I've got for you. So at this point, we can open up to questions.
That was super cool, thank you. So you talked about using, I think, whiteboards and stickies for doing the exercise. Are there any digital tools that you like to use, and also digital tools that work for non-linear backlogs?
Yeah, so story mapping definitely works better if it's a linear activity. So effectively, if you're taking a user on a journey, but to your point, it doesn't have to be. What you can do, for instance, if you've got something that's cross-cutting, you can create buckets and then capture all of the things that need to happen within a bucket, and then from there figure out how to prioritize and unpack what over what. In terms of digital tools, it honestly helps initially if you can get everyone in the room for the first time. Just so that they understand or know how to use the tool, what's going to be happening. So I would strongly suggest do it in person for the first time. After that, some tools that I've used in the past are, I've used Trello, actually. I've used Real-Time Board. You honestly could also just use a blank, depending on what you're doing. You could use a blank document or some type of, like for instance, a Google slide deck, and just take a slide and have people move things around. But pretty much any drawing space where people can collaborate, you can do this with. You can also choose to have one person transcribe and everybody else just recites. But again, this type of stuff, because it's so visual and you want it to be tactile, it is done better in person, but that doesn't mean it isn't impossible to do it remotely. So I hope that answered your question.
Thanks. Really good talk. The Chris Patton book is really great. Any other really good secondary reading that you do or recommend?
You know, it's interesting because Jeff is effectively the authority because he kind of, I'm sure it existed before, but he's the one that solidified it. There are some blogs and articles that kind of, in practice, show you. The technique, honestly, is a very simple one, so I don't know that I would even recommend, you don't really need to read anything just to understand the concept, but I think what is really great is to understand and look at blog posts or articles about how people have actually used it and how it's manifested and what do their maps look like, because there are tons of ways that maps can end up looking at the end. So, this one over here.
Hi. So, given that this is a map of the user journey and not the individual solution, but generally there's also been some design done up front in discovery to validate that the problem is a real problem for customers. How does design fit in? This is something I've always struggled with. Like, we generally might have an idea for our solution by the point that we're building our backlog.
Yeah, so I think that story mapping is part of, so again, and to your point, because this happens towards, I would use this activity, towards the end, so where you've already validated that solution, it still helps to have design in there because they want to validate and clarify are the ideas and the hypotheses that we have in mind, do they make sense? The other thing is you can have current state story maps where you're just mapping out what happens today, and then you can have future state where you're actually mapping out against a potential solution. So I would think it would make sense to have design in, even if to say, for instance, we gained this or we learned this from our research, this is actually what's happening. This is actually what they're going through at this point or this stage. But did I answer because I feel like you're about to say?
It was more about like if you've already got a design, not whether you should have a designer in the room, but whether you should use like wireframes that you might already have in part of the.
Okay. If you have a map, one thing that is pretty cool is if you have a map and you're pretty clear on the work that you need to get done, one thing that I've actually seen is designs will be printed out and actually put up on the wall next to the corresponding steps or stories. So that's one thing. The other thing is, again, everything kind of moves. It's kind of hard because the tool is so comprehensive. Like you can use it in so many different ways. So that would be one place. If you have designs already, put the designs up where they go. And in fact, you could even have another column that states, okay, we're on this screen right now. This is where it's happening. So you can add a location. You can say, this is what's changing. You can even call out another item to add to the legend that I would suggest is if you're actually trying to do like a gap analysis or figure out pain points, so figuring out where the pain is. You can take this story map and say, okay, based on, again, current state, where's the pain, and put up another CP to say that, and then prioritize your opportunities effectively where to solve the pain. So it depends on what you're doing. You can use it in a lot of different places, but it's when you're looking at that journey. So again, current state versus future state, but to me, I don't understand how design wouldn't be involved in this because you're effectively, you're starting to define the problem and then later on can use this to help you define the solution or create the solution.
How do you deal with constraints, like whether they're perceived or real, or whether it's from the actual client or someone from engineering? So whether this story map is in the brainstorming stage or way further down the line where you would actually acknowledge those constraints. Is it when you set the stage and you just tell everyone that for this exercise we're not going to pay attention? How would you?
So I actually believe it's very important to call that out before you even start the scenario. So the first thing I mentioned was give it a name and call out any assumptions, constraints, risks, what it is and what it is not. Those are all part of the assumptions that I would think would go before you even start to build out the map. So I would take time to say, okay, this is the scope of what we're talking about. This is what we're not. We're looking at this particular scenario, as you can tell from the title. And those are scenario or like journey level assumptions. So call out as many constraints as you can think of. Obviously, as you continue to build, you can add more as questions come up. But you do that before you even start building the map. And oftentimes what you'll find is if you don't have enough clarity or you can't get down to the point where you can actually title it, you probably haven't done enough work beforehand to say we're actually only looking at we're building one thing. You may be looking at too many things at once. So definitely before you even start building the map. And this normally takes at most maybe 15, 20. If it takes longer than that, you probably have a problem. But if you're really clear on what you're doing, 5 minutes tops. So.
All right. Well, thank you so much again.